will try to be done in about 30 minutes, maybe a minute or two over that. And as Ross has said, I'm here to talk about monetizing the externalities of animal agriculture. And it's joint with John, who's in the audience. So please direct chat questions to him if you'd like. And if anything's pressing, of course, just ask. Great. So the research question in this project are, what are the welfare gains from reducing animal agriculture? So in a market equilibrium, we would expect private marginal costs to be roughly equal to private marginal benefits. And so the marginal welfare gain can be given by the value of the externalities. And in this market, we think there are two quite large externalities that we're going to focus on here. And the first is that animals do not participate in this market. In some sense, they're forced to participate, but they don't participate in the way we think of in an economic sense. And because there are billions of farmed animals, how they're going to count towards social welfare is clearly going to be important. Second, future humans do not participate in this market. And this is going to be the classic climate economy externality. And for those of you not up on this line of research, animal agriculture contributes about 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, the way we think about how the climate will unfold will be due in some part to how this market operates, how much animal agriculture we have. There are other externalities in this market that have been documented in very interesting work. We're going to set them aside because we think these first two externalities are the most often discussed, and we thought ex ante probably the largest. So we're going to start here. And what we're going to do is offer a first step towards answering this question by first proposing and modifying existing methods for including animals in social welfare calculations. And then we're going to take this welfare function and import it into a climate economy model that we've built in companion work. And every modification of the DICE model tries to come up with some clever name. And so what we called ours was DICE Farm because it's going to have an animal agriculture sector in it. And what this will allow us to do, this framework that we have in this paper, is to quantify the joint externality. So ask about the total size of both of these externalities together under different parameter combinations, and then compare the relative magnitudes of the components. So you might ask something like, okay, if we get a large externality, how much comes from climate cost? How much comes from animal welfare externalities? And as you might imagine, this will be important for how we think about cross-product considerations, which we'll get to as well. And second, if we put a little bit more structure on this, we can perform an optimal policy exercise over, you know, how large should the animal agriculture market be relative to its size now. And in parentheses here, I'm going to just note that we don't ask anything about improving the conditions of farmed animals because we're primarily interested in the marginal externality contemporaneously, though we look forward to future work where perhaps we look at investments in the well-being of animals. Okay, so let me give you a quick overview of the main takeaways before diving into the details. And we're going to use a welfare function that responds negatively to new bad lives. So if a life is not worth living, the welfare function responds negatively to this. And under that assumption, we find the social marginal costs are very, very large. So just to give an order of magnitude here, we find a year of producing a single standard American diet corresponds to costs that are on the $100,000 order of magnitude. And following directly from this, what we find is that the sector should therefore be dramatically reduced. And again, that's going to require a little bit more structure on this model, but it really follows immediately from this really large externality. If this exists, of course, we're going to want to reduce the sector in general. Perhaps more interestingly and policy relevant, what we're going to end up finding is that animal welfare considerations dominate climate considerations. And this will be true under a very wide range of parameters, even though there's going to be, you know, huge uncertainties along both how we measure climate costs and how we measure animal welfare costs. We find these animal welfare costs are going to dominate under most plausible parameters, at least in our view. And this leads to the takeaway that something like a substitution from poultry to beef is likely to be welfare improving despite the well-known climate costs of this substitution. Okay, so that's the paper in a nutshell. And to dive into the details here, I'll start by talking a bit about the welfare function, and then the integrated assessment model, the climate economy model that we modify, and then I'll give you the results and then wrap up here. All right, so the welfare function. The question that we are asking is about how many animals exist. So the counterfactual, if we don't raise animals for food, is not that they, run free. It's that they just never exist. And so what we're going to have to do is come up with a social welfare function that takes into account the social value of these contingent existences. And we're going to follow some, the very sparse literature that's worked on animal welfare issues and use a critical level utilitarian framework. And further, we're going to take this hedonistic or Benthamesque view of utility that is just net pleasure over a lifetime. And while neither of these are universally accepted, I won't have time here, but in the paper, we argue that the social welfare function is likely to provide a lower bound on the costs. So there's very large costs I highlighted. If you disagree either with the kind of totalist criteria here that we should be aggregating populations, or if you think more than just hedons count for welfare, then you would actually find higher social costs. So you can take our estimates as a lower bound relative to perhaps standard alternatives. So mathematically what this looks like, we're going to try and lie as close to the climate economy literature as possible, primarily because we're also asking about these climate costs. But additionally, the climate economics literature seems to be the most mainstream section of economics that's doing interpersonal comparisons in a serious way. So we're going to try and have our welfare function look as similar as possible there. So we'll allow for some social discounting, rho, which we will relax out later and have a more long-termist view for those of you who are interested. And so we're going to sum over time the welfare from humans, which would be all human utilities above the critical level, and we'll sum animal utilities here. So all animal utilities either above or below the critical level. And we allow this moral weight, this scalar here, that says for equivalent hedonistic experiences, you may want to downweight animal utility depending on your ethical view. So we have this here for generality. And as you can see, for those of you not within the population ethics literature or familiar with it, this critical level here is something like a net neutral experience from the point of view of the social welfare function. So if an animal has a life that's exactly equal to the critical level, then this sum would drop out. Let's say all animals have lives that are exactly equal to the critical level, and then it won't matter how many we raise. If they have better than neutral lives, then this adds to welfare, and if they have worse than neutral lives, this subtracts from welfare. So this will be the way that their experiences enter the welfare function. And perhaps an easier way to see what we're getting at here is to look at the analytical expression for the change in welfare with a change in the raising of animals today. So this 0 here is a time subscript saying this is the population of animals today. If we increase it, let's say by 1 animal, what's the welfare effect of this? Well, there are 2 terms here. On the left-hand side, we have the cost to future humans. So these are these climate damages that are completely standard within the integrated assessment world. And this can be written as the change in welfare, individual welfare from a change in temperature, how temperature and some time t responds to a change in the vector of emissions today, and how the vector of emissions changes with raising an extra animal. Okay, so these are these climate costs that will sum over time. And then on the right-hand term, this is what's completely new to our paper here. We have the animal welfare effects of raising an extra animal. So let me start on the right-hand side here. This is going to be how the animal's welfare compares to the critical level here, times the lifespan, and that's because these are in annualized terms. So if we raise an extra animal today and they have annual utility UA, we also have to know how long they live. And then we're going to weight that by theta, which is that moral weight scalar that you could have here. Okay, so actually I've been moving pretty quickly, so maybe I could quickly cover this here. So things you might or perhaps not disagree with, but be wondering about are how this would change relative to standard or alternative views of welfare. So if you think things other than pleasure account for utility, so perhaps something like autonomy matters, that would be a way of saying, well, then our conception of animal utility might be actually even lower than we've conceptualized here, because they don't have these other things like accomplishments or autonomy or other things we think might matter. If you think inequality explicitly matters, so suppose you're an egalitarian or a prioritarian, that would be like raising our concern for animals because their welfare falls on the lower end of the utility distribution. At least that strikes me as a reasonable assumption. If you think the totalist framework is mistaken and you want average welfare or something like it to be what matters, this has been shown to be similar to raising the critical level. So it would be as if saying, you know, animal lives would have to be even better for them to be net beneficial for social welfare. Or you could just throw out the utilitarian framework altogether and say something like rights matter, and then we're done with it. Maybe it's never permissible to have animal agriculture. So later on, when we find these high costs, and you're wondering, well, if I were a prioritarian, how would I feel about this? Your costs might be even higher. Okay, so let me move on to parameterizing this model, which will be perhaps the most interesting part of the talk, or controversial, maybe is a better word. So first, we're going to sit, as I said, as close to possible as the original DICE model. So we'll start here by assuming that there is some pure rate of time preference, 1.5% per year. We personally think this is probably conservative, and this should be closer to 0, but our main results will rely on this. And we'll relax it in robustness checks. And the elasticity of marginal utility with respect to consumption is going to be 1.45, again, taken straight from DICE. So these are standard values. For animals, we're forced to take stances on things that are inherently unknowable, and we're tremendously uncertain about basically everything that comes in the next few slides. So we'll proceed here with great humility, as I note, in 2 steps. And the way we're going to do this is first to try to calibrate something like a critical level here. And we'll do that with a level of human consumption. So we'll say perhaps there's some X such that the utility generated at X is a net neutral experience. And because we're, you know, simplifying here in a way that's quite common, we're going to have consumption be the only value that enters utility. So this is like saying, what is a consumption level such that these lives are net neutral? And once we have this level, we'll then move on to somewhat jointly calibrating this theta A, UA, based on arguments relative to U under bar here. Okay, so the critical level we'll work with is the utility generated at something like the International Purchasing Power Parity Poverty Line of $1.90 per day. And primarily that's just an easy number to grab, and it follows work done by other totalist utilitarian applications where some folks are asking, do things get better or worse when more people exist under this critical level interpretation? And the critical level most commonly used is this International Purchasing Power Poverty Line. So we're gonna follow that, and we're well aware of that there are good arguments both to lower it and to raise it. So the argument that maybe this number should be lower than 190 is that it implies that many human being lives are not socially valuable, which we are sympathetic to, and you know, there are population ethics style arguments that perhaps we should raise the critical level because of something known as the repugnant conclusion, which I'll come back to in a couple of slides. But what's going to matter is where animal utility sits relative to sits relative to this critical level. So if you have any issues with this, hang on for one slide, because it's going to be their joint calibration that is relevant here. It's whether or not an animal has a worthwhile life. Okay, so let me start by saying we're gonna start here with the anti-speciesist assumption that theta A equals 1, and we'll assign differences in subjective experiences within this UA. So we're going to subsume these differences of experiences into UA and say conditional on having the same subjective experience, this should matter the same whether it arises in a human being or arises in an animal. And I think the most common proposal is something like weighting by neurons. That would be an alternative proposal. But our view of this is that this captures something like the intensity of experiences, and that seems better embodied in UA. So if we set theta A equals to 1, essentially what we're saying is if animals have just a lower range of possible experiences, that's just going to be reflected in a UA that is closer to neutrality at all times. So they will matter less in total for welfare, but that comes from their UAs being closer to neutral relative, or rather than us just discounting their experiences. Okay, and now for perhaps the most important assumption of the paper is that we set UA less than U underbar. So the assumption is that animal well-being is less than this critical level here. And some of you may just find this, quite natural that the industrial farm sector likely doesn't raise lives that are worth living. But for those of you who don't share that intuition, let me provide 4 independent and very loose arguments here that might make you believe that this is at least plausible and worth exploring the implications of. So first, we think, based on what we know about the industrial farming sector, that the lives lived there are probably worse from a subjective experience than pets that are, loved, but we think are living net displeasurable lives because, perhaps they're unable to walk very well in old age, and we find it reasonable to euthanize them, or if they have some disease that seems irreversible. So by transitivity, then, if we think that these pets that we love have lives that are worse than non-existent, and we think farmed animals have lives that are worse than that, then they must also have lives that are not worth living. So that's one possible argument that might pull you in the direction to believe this is true. A second one is that this otherwise would lead to something that we call here the repugnant factory farm conclusion, with absolutely no hopes that this term catches on, which would be that if this were not true, if animals added to well-being, then you could generate a world of arbitrarily large factory farms that was preferred to the world that we have now, which we just think is not at all plausible. And so therefore, they must not be adding to social welfare. With tremendous uncertainty, if you put us behind a veil of ignorance, or I will speak for myself here, if you put me behind a veil of ignorance and asked if I would rather live the subjective experience of a human at our perceived critical level here, or the life of an industrially farmed animal, with absolute tremendous uncertainty, given this would also require me inheriting the subjective experience of this animal, I would choose living as a human being at our critical level. And just to be transparent here, what we're going to end up doing is choosing something like $1 per day human utility to be the equivalent of being an industrially farmed animal, for no scientific reason, but just for the fact that this is below our critical level and is a round number. And of course, we'll do some sensitivity tests over this to show you how the results change. And finally, if you think these are just completely ridiculous thought experiments, we could go with something like a wisdom of the crowds approach here and lean on survey evidence where participants are described the life of a broiler chicken and then asked whether or not they believe it's worth living, and believe it's worth living for the chicken, I should say. And the majority view is that this is not a life worth living. So you could even throw away these first three arguments and just say, what do most people think? And most people think that these lives are not worth living. So we think it's a worthwhile exercise to go through here. Okay, so I'll quickly go through the IAM details, which come from this companion work that I've mentioned earlier, where we modify Bill Nordhaus's DICE model to include a farmed animal sector. And this farmed animal sector produces animal products that are consumed by humans, and there are emissions of methane, CO2, and nitrous oxide. And the reason this is not a completely trivial extension of DICE is that the DICE model is interested in industrial emissions, which is nearly 100% carbon dioxide. And because methane and nitrous oxide have very different climate effects than carbon dioxide, we have to replace the atmospheric module in DICE to endogenize the propagation and effects of these gases here. So in that paper, we leave out anything about animal welfare and just compute the classic climate effects of our diets. In this paper, we have to make some further modifications. So we have to take explicit count of the number of animal life years that are lived to produce these different levels of animal products. So creating a hamburger requires some amount of beef cattle lived experiences. And then we replace this human-only welfare with the inclusive social welfare function that I've described. All right, so let me jump into the results here. And what we're going to do is define the social cost of diets in an analogous way to the social cost of carbon. So it's going to be the welfare change from some dietary change we consider, divided by this numeraire, which is the sensitivity of the welfare function with respect to $1 of consumption. So if the dietary change produces twice as many welfare benefits as the consumption change, then it would be a $2 welfare cost. So this is just how we're going to end up monetizing things, is to divide by the welfare effects of a dollar cost. And let me sit on our main table for a second here and talk you through it. So these are these main results, the marginal external welfare costs of our dietary decisions. And we do this both at the dietary level, so non-vegetarian is just a standard diet relative to a vegetarian diet. And then this is at the serving level. Now, this is where we get these extremely large numbers that I highlighted in the introduction. That's corresponding to this number here, which, as you can see, is well over $100,000 per diet per year. And an incredibly small fraction of this is due to the environmental costs. So this number is quite similar to what we estimate in this companion paper, where we ask about the environmental costs. And this number isn't small. It looks small relative to this, gigantic number sitting just above it, but this would be $50 per person per year, which would get quite large when you're thinking about all the dietary decisions made within even just the United States in a given year. But it's completely swamped by this animal welfare cost, which, again, these are the exercise we were hoping to do is just take our best first stab at thinking about how we would naturally include animals in a welfare function, and then give them some human equivalent consumption level, or human equivalent consumption utility level, and then see what this implied about the welfare cost. And the number that pops out is gigantic. And correspondingly, when you look at the serving level, so this would be one serving of chicken versus one serving of beef, it's dominated by chicken just because this is the most animal-intensive product. And underlying these, I should say, is an assumption that these animals live equivalent lives in a utility sense. We understand there's work going on to better disentangle this, but this is mostly for transparency to say if they live equivalent lives, here's the difference in costs. You might think that because pigs seem to be more socially adept than chickens, that they have worse subjective experiences in these conditions, and so this number would go up. But the point of this table is to show that the animal welfare consideration is dominating the total costs here. I'm going to skip this. This is a bit of an intuition about why these numbers are so large. We can talk about them later if you're interested. But this is a much...
So, you have 5 minutes. So
perfect. Thank you. Good. So what you're almost certainly immediately wondering is how sensitive these numbers are to our calibration of the well-being of animals, which, of course, as we said, we set at the equivalent of $1 per day human equivalent utility. And it's, of course, going to be sensitive to this, because if their lives are neutral, let's say, our critical level was 190 per day, so this x-axis is the human equivalent dollars per day, then there are essentially no social costs. I mean, really, it's the climate cost, but they're too small to see based on the scaling here. This 1 is our baseline. And as you move from our baseline assumption down to an assumption that they live neutral lives, these costs fall quite rapidly. The thing we want to point out is, even if you thought 180 was a better number than $1 per day, because this is lower than the critical level, it turns out that these are still on the thousands of dollars per diet per year. So if you agree with the qualitative statement that animals have lives not worth living, basically any quantitative interpretation of that or implementation of that gets you very, very large numbers here. Okay, let me close here by giving a quick slide on the policy implications, which first, of course, if this is at all close to reality, there's way too much animal agriculture in a market equilibrium, which we show in the paper a bit more formally. But second, these animal welfare considerations dominate, which would imply something like we should switch from eating poultry to eating beef if we were going to hold our consumption fixed. But you might think that this is sensitive to hard to test assumptions across externality types. So maybe climate damages are much bigger. And in fact, the DICE model is criticized for having small climate damages. Or perhaps you think we should be speciesist and downweight animal welfare. So the final thing we do here is create this indifference map, which on the y-axis says, what if our animal welfare costs are 5% of the level we estimate in baseline? What if they're 1% of what we estimate in baseline? The x-axis says, what if we change the climate module by reducing the discount factor and increasing the damages to ramp up climate damages, as measured by the social cost of carbon here? And the key takeaway here is this line of indifference where the costs of these products are equal. So for example, the way to read this is, if we've overestimated animal welfare costs by 100 times, so they're really 1% of our level, you still would need a climate module that generates a $1,000 social cost of carbon to reverse this takeaway that poultry reduction should be prioritized. And you know, the standard estimates for this are in the $50 range, social cost of carbon. Getting to 1,000 would take some serious modifications that we've not seen in the literature. So despite all of the uncertainties, I'll close by just saying the relative takeaway across products seems pretty robust within this framework, at least. And good, I'll open it up for questions now and sit on this slide here for a second.